All right, this is part 2 of lecture 28 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds, Monarchs, Popes, Serfs, and Vassals. In the last part of this lecture, we looked at a few specific political examples of what had happened to France and Germany and the wider sort of Western Europe in the aftermath of the breakdown of Carolingian authority. And one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize there was a negotiation. Was an critical component of politics in the Middle Ages. Monarchs were not absolute, popes were not infallible, and while negotiation often involved violence, it revolved also around ideals of legitimacy and would eventually come up as a compromise in most situations. How were these developing kingdoms actually governed, though? The real answer is in lots of different ways. There wasn't one way of doing things, even in the same kingdom usually, or sometimes even in the same little local valley. This was not a society of systematic forms of organized governments. There were no constitutions in this time period, but rather a series of ad hoc arrangements that changed over time and, very critically, again, were subject to debate and negotiation. One thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that things were very different from place to place within Europe and over time. But even in one particular place in time, the various people involved, nobles and churchmen, wouldn't necessarily agree with each other about what was the traditional and accepted form of practice and would need to negotiate it. The traditional answer, though, to how we would describe all of these various forms of organization used to be feudalism, which I often like to refer to as the F word of history. This was a very simplistic example that would say, well, there's this pyramid and the king's at the top, and under him are the nobles, and then there are knights, and then there are peasants, and so on and so forth, this feudal hierarchy. You've got lots of discussions of the great chain of being and so on. And this problem with this is that no one in the Middle Ages had ever heard of feudalism. It's a term popularized by historians trying to make sense of the crazy legal mess of the Middle Ages later, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. And historians today hate the term feudalism. I have colleagues that won't even use the word in class. The problem is it makes everything way too neat and tidy even within Western Europe, and it gets even worse when people start trying to apply this notion of feudalism to other places like samurai-era Japan of the 15 to 1800s or the Seljuq and Mamluk Middle East, as we'll see in a moment. I find it's better to try and limit what the term means, and that's one approach that modern historians have tried to do. Personally, I don't like to throw out the term feudalism entirely because most of my students are already familiar with this, and if I don't address it, then I can't correct it. It should not be used to cover all aspects of medieval society. That's probably the first thing to get about feudalism. In origin, feudalism comes from the Latin feudum, that is, in English, a fief. Which is a piece of land granted by a noble or a royal lord, or sometimes a powerful religious figure like a bishop or an abbot, to a lesser aristocrat. The person granting the land is called a liege, or a lord, or a liege lord. There's a variety of different titles. It can become very confusing. And the person getting the land, though, is almost always called a vassal. The idea that the vassal will use the land to pay for troops the idea is that the vassal will use this land to pay for troops, primarily to raise those highly trained knights that we saw developing last time in Normandy. And knights are very expensive. Their horses and their armor aren't cheap, and more importantly, they really need to spend a lot of time training to properly do that fantastically effective cavalry charge, heavy cavalry charge. The vassal would owe a certain amount of military service then to their liege lord, not just themselves personally, but they would use this land in order to raise up and train further knights. In England, this is often called a knight's fee, and the amount of knights that a particular piece of property is supposed to bestow will actually be spelled out. The problem with simplifying this is that, as I said, it was all very highly idiosyncratic, and variable. Every liege lord-vassal relationship was different, but there are important qualities that stand out. One, these arrangements were personal. There was, as we saw with the very early example of Rollo and Charles the Simple, a ceremony done face-to-face and before other nobles, where the vassal swore an oath of homage, witnessed by the church. Breaking that oath was a big deal. You might be able to get away with it if you were powerful enough, but it would really hurt your soft power. That is your honor, your face, your ability to convince other people of the rightness of their cause. And two, these arrangements were reciprocal. The vassal had to show up with troops if his liege lord called him, or her. Actually, at least in some cases, the liege lord would be a her. But if the vassal was attacked by someone else, it was the liege's job to summon the other vassals and protect them. There might be other responsibilities. One very common element is that the lord had to listen to the advice of his vassals. But that could be open to quite a bit of interpretation. But we actually do see vassals who are willing to fight to demand the right to give advice. The important thing here is that if either side broke this deal, then the other party could claim the fief, theoretically. Usually they would then fight for it, but they would also bring in lawyers. And that's point 3. These arrangements, like all political systems, were open to interpretation and involved constant negotiations. We've already seen this with Charles and Rollo, and we'll see it again with events like Magna Carta. And this really shouldn't surprise us. It's not like modern politics aren't open to interpretation. A great deal of difficulty in the United States today, right, is what are the intentions of the Founding Fathers for the Constitution? And people will bring up arguments on either side about how the Constitution should work. And will try various different avenues in order to make their approach felt. And the same was absolutely true in the Middle Ages. Feudalism was, and perhaps even more, because of course there was no feudal constitution necessarily to refer back to. A lot of this was based on custom, and that of course could be different in the minds of each individual trying to recall the customs. All right, so far so good. But lots of governments have devolved land rights to subordinates. It reduced the central authority's bureaucratic requirements, albeit at a cost of direct control. We saw the late Roman government, the Dominate, for instance, in the West, do this with the Visigoths in southern Gaul and later in Spain. Remember, they had actually given them sort of a semi-independent kingdom, well, an effectively independent kingdom, but still provided their blessing, the legitimacy of Roman authority to them. We're going to see something similar to this in the Islamic world as well. So what makes Western European feudalism different? Well, again, this is highly debatable, but I think one of the key issues has to do with the problem of nobility. The issue was that in the former Carolingian Empire, particularly in Western Francia, what became France, which really descended into total political anarchy in the 900s, these vassals ended up getting way too much power on their own, and eventually in many places, especially like I said, France, managed to secure hereditary rights to the land for their families, and often to one degree or another the actual right to govern the land as well as tax it, that is, administering justice and so on. Technically, the inheritor of a fief would still have to go make the oath of homage to those Capetian kings in Paris, for instance, but that was often a formality, as we saw as far back as with Rollo and Charles the Simple. This formal process was something you had to do. You couldn't get away with ignoring it entirely, but it might not mean very much in practice. Well, it got even crazier. Since these fiefs were now inherited, the familial relationship could leave lords owning fiefs all over the place, sometimes even in different kingdoms. So you should never imagine that a lord simply owns one contiguous piece of territory. That's often the mistake I see in fantasy depictions of the Middle Ages, like in Game of Thrones. Lords own these nice, compact little bundles of land. That's not how inherited lordship would actually work in practice. Because you would slowly inherit various different lands as you married into other families. Well, to top all of this off, many of the larger vassals would be lieges to smaller vassals underneath them, a process that is sometimes called sub-infeudation, which really begins to tell you how stupidly complex the word feudalism can become. As you can imagine, things got very confusing and complicated very fast. But one important thing to keep in mind was that every liege lord, all the way up to the kings, always kept at least some land for their own personal use, and this is where most of their revenues came from. So the King of England, for instance, was actually also the largest landholder in England. Now, technically, all land in England devolved by right from the king, but the king would keep an enormous amount of it for his own personal use, whether that be to reward particularly loyal followers, which was an important aspect of holding some of this land, or most importantly, to get direct revenues from, since kings in this time period collected very little in terms of taxation from their vassals. Remember, vassals are only supposed to show up for military service and perhaps a few other things. So every lord needed to control some land directly in order to pay for their own day-to-day upkeep. Continuing on the example of English kings, we have William the Conqueror, who we talked about last time when we were discussing the Normans. Now, technically, William was Duke of Normandy, and in this respect, he owed his fief of Normandy to the Capetian King of France in Paris. But as we saw with his ancestor Rollo, that oath of homage wasn't always taken all that seriously. But William was also King of England in his own right, which actually made him vastly more powerful than the Capetian kings in Paris. To make matters even more complicated, William had his own Norman vassals, barons within Normandy, who all got fiefs in England from him when he took over there, but kept their fiefs in Normandy. So the situation of these feudal relationships could really be extremely complex. And those barons might have a different sort of responsibility of liege-vassal relationship in Normandy, for instance, than they did in England, even though it was the same person owing allegiance to the same overlord in both cases. But whether that overlord was William as Duke in Normandy or as King in England could involve different feudal relationships, even with the same individual vassals. Okay, that is feudalism in the narrow sense that I personally, as a scholar, advocate for. Separate from the feudal relationship amongst the nobles and kings was the situation for the vast majority of people, who we commonly today call peasants or sometimes serfs. And there is a distinction between the two that I'll get to. But again, this was a vastly diverse and complex set of relationships that we now call broadly manorialism. And that was because it was based around the big manor house of the owner of a particular area of land, who was also confusingly called a lord. But crucially, non-lords, like serfs and peasants, were never part of feudal relationships, which did not extend beyond the aristocracy. Nobody expected a peasant to make an oath of homage. They weren't honorable, they weren't part of this noble class, this hereditary noble class. They were just expected to behave without any kind of the reciprocal relationships that one, well, really almost none of the reciprocal relationships that one would expect in the feudal system amongst the people at the top. Now, there were free peasants who owned their own small farms. What percentage of the population they were varied from place to place and over time. And it also, in most people who lived in the small towns and cities were also free. Now, earlier in the Middle Ages, many common laborers were still slaves. That had been the dominant form, probably, there's a huge debate about this, in the late Roman Dominate period. But somewhere around the year 1000, there was a tipping point to a new social condition in much of Western Europe called serfdom. Now, serfs were not slaves, in that they could not be bought and sold. However, they couldn't leave the manor they were associated with either, so they weren't entirely free. We often use the term unfree. This is a very difficult term for most modern Americans to get their minds around. We have this intense dichotomy between total slavery and absolute freedom, but that was not the norm before the modern era. Levels of freedom were much more common. Moreover, these unfree serfs had numerous obligations to whoever was lord of the manor. This almost always involved working on the lord's personal fields agricultural fields for free. Now, serfs usually owed other customary obligations to their lord, which were numerous and varied. And again, this would vary from place to place and time to time, but this might involve having to give the lord their best farm animal when they died, basically having to give will away your best farm animal to your lord. They might also involve having to use the lord's mill for grinding their grain. We'll come back to the idea of these mills in the third part of this lecture. And generally other things that made the lords richer and the serfs both poorer and often humiliated so that they knew their place in society. This was definitely a system that not only had economic but also social overtones. However, as far as modern historians can tell, this never involved female serfs owing their lords sex on their wedding night. That was a rather lurid fiction invented by the sexually repressed Victorians in the 1800s. Maybe slightly before the Victorians, but the Victorians ate this stuff up. Serfs did have a small amount of land to use for their own upkeep where they were tenants of the lord of the manor. And again, they weren't slaves. They had rights, not many, but they weren't property. Those limited rights that they did have, they fought very hard for. Slavery actually largely died out in Western Europe in the High Middle Ages, although the institution wasn't necessarily banned entirely. In some places, where royal power broke down entirely and feudalism got really bad and complicated, the lord of the manor, as holder of the fief, was also the chief justice on his manors. And believe me, you never want your landlord to also be your judge. That's a major conflict of interest, considering that so much of legal disputes involve property. This meant that when kings began to take back control from their vassals and started to centralize political control by running judicial courts, the serfs and peasants generally loved them for it. A smart king painted himself as a champion of the poor at the expense of the power of his noble vassals, because nobody really considered the poor to be an actual political threat to them. And that's also, it's worth pointing out here, the lord, in the places where the lord of the manor was also the font of justice, he would be the judge also for free peasants. And he might decide that they, if a dispute came up, that they weren't free and they were actually serfs. And since he was the judge in the area, he got to decide. You can see why this would cause all kinds of problems. But I want to emphasize again, not everywhere where this sort of system existed were local nobles also judges. Again, the whole system is extremely complicated. Now, technically, the institutions of manorialism and feudalism should be seen as separate from each other, but they both enshrined the special status of certain families in Europe, which became the nobility. And these nobles almost always had further special privileges enshrined in law. This is another key element of our sort of discussion of feudalism in its specifically Western European context. So these nobles would have special rights that went on to not only separate them from unfree serfs, but even from other free men and women who were peasants. For instance, nobles often faced less severe criminal penalties, and they usually got vastly unequal political representation in any formal legal bodies that developed over time, like the English Parliament, which still exists today in the separate houses of Commons and Lords in the United Kingdom Parliament today. So this has been the Western European model. What I want to do now is compare this with a similar situation that developed in Islam. Now, recall from our last lecture on the Normans and Turks that we saw a new ruling ethnic group sweep into the Middle East, the Seljuq Turks, who we saw invaded Arab and Persian lands and then propped up the declining Abbasid caliphs. Some fundamentals are superficially similar to feudalism in the situation set up, or at least solidified under the Seljuks, but there were also crucial differences. Now, in the golden age of the caliphate, and even after Harun al-Rashid's death in the early 800s, caliphs managed to keep fairly firm control over the bureaucracy and revenue of their enormous empire. But we've already seen that Abbasid authority declined precipitously in the later 800s and 900s, and local governors had tended to become independent, setting up local dynasties, which were dynasties, they were hereditary, but still claiming to be working for the Abbasids. The Abbasids were still, caliphs were still the source of legitimacy, even if they were no longer actually all that powerful. And this is sort of similar to the way we've seen earlier with the Visigoths and Ostrogoths wanting Roman legitimacy, even though they were effectively independent, and the Romans didn't have any power in that particular region they had taken over. Well, with increasing frequency in the 1000s after the Seljuks arrived with their own relatively simple nomadic political structure, it became easier for Muslim lords to parcel out cities and territories to various nobles, often called emirs. And I should note that the Middle East was vastly more urbanized, so often these emirs would be based at a city like Damascus or Aleppo or Mosul. These lords, these emirs, would then further hand out the revenues from smaller parcels of land that were called iqtas to subcommanders, with the formal understanding that the subcommander would use the revenue to pay to bring troops. Well, that looks a lot like feudalism. But in reality, it's a much more ubiquitous system called tax farming, where the central government basically gives up the right to collect taxes because it lacks the bureaucratic power to administer the taxes itself, usually because central authority has broken down, but sometimes because it was just less hassle. Even the Roman Empire had done this to a degree. The people who collected taxes in the Roman Empire usually weren't actually officials of the central Roman government. They bid on the right to go collect taxes on an annual basis, and then would farm them out, and whatever extra they could acquire from the amount that they bid would sort of be their incentive, right? This is sort of the libertarian approach to taxation, to make a joke on that front. In this case, though, there was this particular response, which was you would make in the iqtas, you would collect the taxes, and in return you would bring military forces. In that respect, it looks a bit like feudalism in Western Europe. However, the iqtas were still legally the possessions of the central government, and they never became hereditary possessions of the families collecting taxes from them, unlike in Western Europe. Sometimes a father managed to pass off an iqta to his son, maybe even a grandson, but this was an exception and never became formally enshrined in Islamic law, as it did in many kingdoms in Europe. Iqta holders also couldn't further subdivide their iqtas as vassals could their fiefs, because the iqta holder didn't own the land of the iqta outright. He just collected the revenue in return for providing military service. Finally, in the Islamic world, no specially privileged noble class or unfree serf class developed. Iqtas were not manors. They might have full slaves working on them, but they also had free Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people working on them, depending on the place. Iqta holders never became a recognized separate legal class from other Muslims with special privileges from their birth status, nor did they ever get formal power to administer justice on their iqtas. Certainly, they had more money and influence, but Islamic legal scholars, who we'll be discussing more in a few lectures, retained control over the Muslim legal system, and always affirmed that all free Muslims were equal before this law. Iqtas were therefore a sign that centralized authority and bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy that went with it, had broken down in the Islamic world, much as vassals and fiefs indicated in Western Europe. And this is actually a major reason why the First Crusade will be successful, because political authority has broken down in the Islamic world, and so the Crusaders did not face a unified Islamic opponent. But the situation never developed into anything like full-on Western feudalism, if we can paint this highly diverse, high medieval institution in Europe in these very broad strokes that I've outlined here. Okay, so this section of the lecture, part 2, has really tried to explain the mechanics of feudal arrangements and manorial arrangements, but also tried to explain how these were very diverse and at the same time different from similar situations in other parts of the world. In the last part, in part 3, we'll talk about some other developments that happened coincidentally around the same time, around the year 1000 and afterwards.